Before we start today's episode, I have some exciting news. From April 7th to 11th, 2025, I will be hosting a free online virtual summit called No More Heroes. This is a gathering of men's work leaders from across North America, and we're going to be diving into myth, initiation, fatherhood, archetype, and the masculine psyche as a whole. Furthermore, we'll be looking at where we are in terms of men's work today and where we ought to be going to bring forward a brighter world. If this is interesting to you, good news. It's free and open to everybody. You can find a link to reserve your seat in the description below. Now on to the show. The Smiling Human podcast is made possible by listeners like you. If you would like to experience more of these shows into the future, then please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/thesmilinghuman. Hello, and welcome to The Smiling Human, where collectively we evolve through inquiry. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Smiling Human podcast. Today, I'm speaking with Ian MacKenzie. Ian MacKenzie is a mythosomatic guide and filmmaker. He is also the founder of the Mythic Masculine, a platform dedicated to realigning masculinity with thriving life. For over 15 years, he's been tracking the global emergence of imaginal culture. From the desert of Burning Man to the heart of Occupy Wall Street, he has sought and amplified the voices of visionaries, artists, and activists who have been working towards planetary system change. He is the co-director of the Village of Lovers, as well as Lost Nation Road, Amplify Her, and Sacred Economics. Our conversation today focuses on the necessity and nature of myth for culture and masculinity more broadly. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Fantastic. Well, Ian, welcome to the Smiling Human podcast. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for the invitation, Oak.
Yeah, so I'd love to start off the show with the question I ask each guest, which is, what is the last thing that made you smile?
The last thing that made me smile. Well, let's see, a few days ago, I went on a hike with a friend that, we haven't had too much sun in this area. This is Vancouver Island. And we just got hit with a really beautiful afternoon on Sunday. And there's an area around this area where I live, but a place along the river that I had never hiked to. I always knew that there was a kind of a longer hike option in that particular area. But my friend, he had done it many times. And he's like, do you want to do the long loop? And I said, yeah, let's do it. So we basically got to really go for about a 2-hour hike. And we just had a beautiful spot where it's like a Gary Oak meadow kind of overlooking this glorious river. And he had some nice tea. So we got to sit in the sunshine, drink some tea, look out of this beautiful natural expanse. And life was certainly pretty good in that moment. And I'm pretty sure I smiled a few times at just the glory of it all. So that's what comes to mind right now.
Beautiful. What rich, abundant beauty. I love that. Thank you for sharing, Ian. And the listeners would have had a bit of an intro to the work that you have done and are doing in the intro to the episode. And so rather than reiterating that, I had a warm curiosity to inquire about mythopoiesis and myth in general. I know that your own podcast, The Mythic Masculine, is focused around the intersection of many different topics, core to most of them being myth and masculinity. And so if you could offer the audience just a overview of what that term even means, mythopoiesis.
Mm-hmm. Well, my understanding is that term itself was actually coined by J.R.R. Tolkien for, I suppose, describing what he did with Lord of the Rings, which was essentially like the creation of myth and maybe mythic worlds. And so that I believe was a sort of a seed of what then became known as mythopoetics, but somewhat like maybe a parallel influence, not necessarily a direct influence, because then the term mythopoetics began to describe what I think was picked up by folks like Robert Bly, of course, the accomplished American poet, who turned towards fairy tales and myth and mythopoetics pretty late in his life. There's actually an excellent documentary called A Thousand Years of Joy. I'm not sure if you've seen that yet, but it's about Robert Bly and his life. And it actually immensely enriched my understanding of the man who, again, I only really knew him from the chapter that he started getting into masculinity and, of course, Iron John, the book that ended up sort of sparking the whole men's mythopoetic movement in the early 90s. But I also have another definition. I believe it was Martin Shaw, the storyteller, who also intersected with Bly. And actually, it was Robert Bly who brought Martin Shaw over to the US for the first time, I believe. But he described, and I think he was quoting another fellow, Robert Bringhurst, a lot of names in here. Robert Bringhurst, who is he's sort of a sort of a language archivist, I suppose, or certainly an accomplished poet. He's an American, I think, but he lives close by, actually, here, one of the islands off the coast, Robert Bringhurst. And there's a understanding that mythopoetics is somewhere that it's like myth and story and poetry or culture itself have yet to diverge. Like this understanding that they're all actually, they intersect in a way that is recognizable for its ability to add dimensionality to sense making, right? And I believe it was Bly as well who might have said that the mythopoetics is the vertical axis of understanding when so much seems horizontal in the landscape of the literal, right? And it's interesting to think that if a culture ever believes that they are or not mythological, or you could say, the sort of humanist current modern society in a way seems demythologized, right? It starts to be, that's in the past. Myth actually has come to mean something that is not true, right? Oh, it's a myth. And it's interesting to track that, right? That we come to a time when myth is understood to simply be, something made up or quaint and not factually accurate, or these kind of things. But that just means that the mythic understanding has just gone underground, and that a culture that doesn't believe themselves to be mythically impacted or oriented is mostly dangerous, I think, because it just means it's there. They're just not willing to recognize it, right? You might say like the mythology that operates modern humans in this sort of emergent technocratic society is exactly that. Things like the myth of progress, like a mythology of it's always getting better, that the current modern humans are the best that there's ever been, right? From the sort of primitives in the past to the glory and in the ascent of modern day, and Elon Musk and all these characters, it's just right there for them as well. So a lot in there, but maybe that's good enough to kick us off for this conversation.
Fantastic. Absolutely. There was a few major pillars within that I think offer meaningful direction for a conversation. And the first being the dimension of sensibility. I think that this is a really core piece to how important myth is when it comes to cultural narrativization, the understanding of what it means to be human, and also what it means to be a man inside of culture in today's world. And when you're speaking about sensibility, I am reminded of Jonathan Vervaeke's work and making things intelligible, and the meaning crisis in particular. And I think that there's a very potent overlap taking place between what could be called the meaning crisis and this demythologizing of our nature, of our culture, of our art, of our institutions. In a sense, when we have this new connotation of falsehood or quaintness to the word myth, we actually blind ourselves, in my opinion, to the meaning-making power inside of myth. In a sense, myth is populated by symbol, by archetype, by arc, by all of these different elements of the non-linear, non-direct use of language and capacity of meaning-making of the human psyche. And each of these pieces, the myth, the archetype, the symbol, to use a few, serve as the architecture of meaning-making and sensibility. We might think that we look out and recognize things as they are, but the science of perception tells us that is absolutely not the case, that our interpretive framework relies on suchness, likeness, similitude, metaphor, symbol, reference, and story in order to make any sense of the things that are going on. And so to bring this around and to perhaps offer a solidified trajectory, the demythologizing as it relates to the masculine role in society is one that I think contributes greatly to the suffering that we're seeing. And I'm curious what you think about the intersection of those two.
Well, it's probably helpful too to make some, start to tease apart some of this. You could call it, eras of masculinity. If we're talking about, let's just say, masculinity in the West, and Bly does this in Iron John, right? He talks about the '50s man, right? As this often referred to by even modern day conservatives and alt-right folk as the sort of golden age, right? Traditional masculinity, when men were men. They knew what was theirs to do, to go to work, to provide. Woman was in the kitchen, taking care of the kids. They even have the hashtag now, trad wife. I don't know if you've seen that before, right? This sort of resurgence of this traditional wife, right? And there's a sense that feminism is the problem. Feminism was the thing that said, women, you can have more. You can get out of the home. You can earn your own wage and be boss babe or girl boss or whatever. And they decry that as essentially like an upending of a proper order, a proper natural order of where men and masculinity was clear. And then, as we shifted into the sort of 60s, 70s, Bly calls this, it was the rise of the soft male, right? Of course, not across the board, of course not, but a sense that men needed to be more emotional, that it was in fact desirable to connect with the feminine, right, or their feminine, to access more emotions, to be able to articulate that. And on the one hand, that seems to be positive in the sense that men were able to tap more deeply into their inner landscape, which is also where the roots of the mythopoietic men's movement arose or came from as well. Bly talks about, apparently, he didn't really like even the term mythopoietic, right? He liked more this idea of calling the movement itself, right? Because again, a lot of people say it wasn't really a movement. Michael Meade also, who was one of the core trifecta, James Hillman, Robert Bly, Michael Meade, they were kind of like the main triad. But this idea that Bly just really wanted to call it something like the expressive men's movement, because he just wanted men to be able to like feel again and be able to express, right? To kind of awaken from this numbness. And so again, that kind of comes on the heels of the sort of 50s button-down man who, wasn't that emotional and couldn't articulate their landscape, stuffed it down with booze and alcohol, all that kind of stuff. And then now we've seen a swing as well since then, whereas this desire of men should be men again, men should be powerful. You see this a lot with the manosphere and this idea that men need to be competitive and dominant. And, they have a language now of like, the alpha male and the beta and all this kind of stuff, right? It's very hierarchically positioned. Where are you in the hierarchy? And this is totally understandable when you understand the water that we swim in, generally in the dominant society of the West, is what Rian Eisler would call a domination culture. Right? It's a culture that operates on subtle or overt forms of domination. And if somebody's wondering, like, what do you mean by that? It's basically there's ways in which you are essentially are coerced, right, or threatened to stay in line or else. Right? It's the punitive justice system where, of course, you step out of line, you commit a crime, and you do the time, as they say. And there's a resurgence of that. I think I even heard Trump not too long ago. This is before the election. Say something like, on his first day of office, he's going to crack down and all these offenders. Right? They're going to be. I mean, I think he even threatened to have some kind of violent heyday, basically, against criminals, because the whole idea is that you just banish the criminals, banish the bad guys, and everything will be better. So again, this idea that that's even possible to discern the quote good from the bad with such clear delineation, that itself is it's sort of a warped understanding of the white knight, right? And again, Bly talks about this in Iron John. I mean, I'm referencing it quite a bit now, but talks about the red, the white, and the black. These are the three kinds of armor, right, that the young prince takes or wears in the tournament. But the way Bly talks about that is the white knight, right, is the one, of course, who wants to be on the side of the good and sees the world very clear. And, okay, this is the right decision. This is the wrong decision. Going good guys, bad guys. And that works somewhat ironically in the opposite as well, right? The bad guys always think they're the good guys, right? Or what they're doing is justified and justifiable. And that plays itself out over and over again. So I just say this in terms of, what are we referencing in terms of what is the ideal masculinity, right? It really depends often on who's doing the looking, what class are they from actually, right? And what are they told is the quote, right kind of masculinity. Certain qualities though seem present in different ways. What is strength, right? And depending on what paradigm of masculinity you're looking at, is strength vulnerability, which it seems to be more in the emotional quadrant, right, of masculinity, expressive masculinity. To be emotional is that's to be like vulnerable and emotionally accessible. Like that's the most ideal, right? That's the courage. A lot of the like Sacred Sons, these kind of guys, they're big on that stuff, connecting to the heart, which I agree with. And then at the same time, there's others who, again, traditional masculinity, if you call it that, it's about being stoic and not being emotional and getting the job done and neutralizing the enemy and these kinds of things that are venerated, more of the warrior class. So clearly, there's no sort of direct answers in a way, but there is a way to begin to again see how these forces intersect with each other and how these projections and idealizations, like where are they based in, right? Where are they coming from, and how might we more consciously create a diversity that again invites a kind of realignment with the masculinity that we actually need, which I believe, which is masculinity in service to life itself instead of one that destroys life.
It's really interesting to look at the progression of what the ideal masculine has been projected as or perceived to be through these cultural eras. And I'd love to work through what you've offered here in terms of those eras, as well as a couple other pieces, because when we think about the 50s, one of the things that immediately came to mind was the book No More Mr. Nice Guy. And in that book, he speaks to a cultural phenomenon among men that occurred post-World War, where there was this feminization, and that sort of leads to the soft male. And in his words anyways, or in his perspective, the author's perspective, there's a piece missing that is crucial for activated and engaged masculinity inside of culture, that it's missing when we are overemphasizing femininity inside masculine maturation. But before this, the reason I bring this book up is because for those who idealize the masculinity of the 50s, I chuckle a little bit, because that was, rampant alcoholism, PTSD from post-war. You had spousal abuse, infidelity. Sure, the marriages lasted longer, but I would be hard-pressed to say that they were healthier by any metric. And so I go, okay, that's obviously not what people are idealizing, alcoholism and spousal abuse. If you are, you're insane, and we're not listening to that voice anyways. But what is it that's so attractive about that? And I think it's the difference between the role, what the role was. Okay, the man knows that he needs to provide and go do these things and be the strong man and stiff upper lip, yada, yada, versus having a place in general. And I think that that's one of the pieces insofar as the conversations I've had with men, more and more of what is ours, or what is rightfully for men or rightfully for the masculine, seems to be dissolving. And yeah, the fingers get pointed, right? Well, it's this cultural aspect, or it's this author, or it's feminism, or it's, whatever. The blame is not really the issue at question. The issue is, as far as I can see it, is that the majority of boys growing up don't have somewhere to be, a place to occupy. And the masculine is this spaciousness. It is taking up space. It is this expressive, this expansive. The yang aspect is the externalizing into the world. And so if there isn't somewhere from which a man can do this or a boy can learn to rightfully do this, it leads to a great deal of confusion. And this brings us around to the idea of hierarchy and this sort of resurgence of post-war American idealism. Don't get me wrong, I understand the virtue in many of the conservative values. I understand the virtue in many liberal values as well. I would posture that in many cases I find myself to be meta-political because the issues themselves are propositional, and that's where I would take my stance rather than in terms of a party or any sort of wing, so to say. But I digress. The hierarchy offers a very clear place for a man to be. If I know that there's a structure that I can be alpha or sigma or beta or whatever letter you want to use, there is somewhere for me to be, and there's a pathway that is clearly delineated for me to get there, immediately the problem of not having a place is solved. And so it's clung on to because it's intelligible, because it offers directive, it offers orientation, all of these things that satiate the famine of meaning. The last thing I'll say before I pass it back to you is the idea of ideal masculinity. And I love your offering, Ian, and it resonates deeply with my own heart and with my own work in this world with men and just in general, that service is really central. And how that service comes to be is kind of what I wrote in my notes as I was listening to you. Ideal masculinity is based on the individual's temperament, right? Like we cannot expect, and I think this is what we learned positively from the movement through the 60s and the 70s and the expansion of feminist philosophy, as well as other different schools of thought, that not every man is going to be stiff upper lip, super buff, aggressive, provider, multimillionaire, above 6 feet tall, whatever these weird ideals are. But that the idea that there is an ideal expression of masculinity for each man, I think is true. And I think that it comes through, at least in part, prioritizing looking inward at the authentic inner emotional and mental world and going, what does it look like for me to be in amplified service? What does it look like for me to be embodied in my masculinity? So a cloud of thoughts there.
Number of threads. Let me see. I could pick up a few. I mean, one, I think that, you could, again, if you go back to the 50s for a second, I just listened to this talk on YouTube. It's by this author. She wrote a book called Before War. And what she was writing about, I just listened to the talk, which sort of encompassed her main points. But she was saying that the current paradigm that the West is, right, this hierarchy, structures of domination, when that's all you've known, or for many folks, right, if it's all we've known, it's hard to imagine that it could be otherwise, right? And that's why we have a lot of, scholarship or academia, or just a general sense of a perception that this is the way it's always been, right? Men are competing and at war with each other, and that's just the way it is. And women, should be subservient because the men are powerful in this other way, and they need to take care of the kids, and that's just how natural order works. But there has been cultures in the past and even present that actually don't follow that same model. And there's reasons for that, reasons in terms of the consequence of colonization and empire and all the rest. But just to know that there's a seduction in whatever paradigm you're in to cast the spell that it's always been this way. Right. And so I think in terms of the uncertainty that a lot of men face now, I think actually largely due to technological disruption and economic siphoning of the economic financial resource, up to the top percents, very few percent, 1% control X amount, but it's actually 0.001% control, trillions. That and the loss of economic employment that is meaningful to a degree. Like ultimately, I think that's the biggest indicator actually of men's crisis of meaning, it's not blaming women for taking their jobs or whatever it is. It's actually men feeling a sense of purposelessness, right? Because they actually have lost opportunity to feel purposeful, to participate in an economy meaningfully, and to afford things that are, afford a sort of standard of living that is comfortable enough, right? And in that sense, the story that they've been told, which is again to ascend, up the ladder as best you can, or control resource, or control economic power, because that's ultimately where power lies. For men that kind of go up that ladder and realize actually that it wasn't what they were sold, right? They feel like a sense of the emptiness, or what the consequence was to pursue that dream. I mean, I'm thinking almost the Wolf of Wall Street, right? But I think Leonardo DiCaprio's character was somewhat of a sociopath too. But that kind of rapacious capitalistic paradigm, hypersexed as well, which is actually not a coincidence, right? Because in that paradigm, sex also becomes a form of domination, distraction, validation, right? Very different. So it's subsumed to this paradigm of domination and hierarchy. So in terms of, for men, I think the biggest poverty that a lot of men face too is not being invited into a meaningful cosmology, right? Of what are we here to do? What is meaningful, right? And what does it mean to not be in service of ego? And by that, even, I mean like the ego of empire, right? That men, I think, do have an innate longing to feel useful and purposeful. And when there's no substitute for that, I think Charles Eisenstein called this the great robbery, actually, in this piece he wrote quite a while ago, where he said that there's a time when youth, and we're just speaking to young men for a second, that they come of age in their late teens, early 20s, and there is this longing, this feeling of like, okay, when am I really going to be told what's going on, right? When am I going to be included in the big story of like, yeah, what does it all mean? Why am I here? Where are the adults that actually get it and can invite me into that, right? And a lot of youth go walkabout, right? They take a gap year. They sort of pursued on their own, as I did. I went to Australia, actually the furthest away I could get from where I was. And then, of course, found out from my time there that, oh, there I was again, right? I couldn't outrun the part of me that was vacant, like of wanting that sense of meaning, but couldn't find it and thought I'd find it elsewhere. And I should say that it wasn't ultimately mine to find either. And this is what I mean by the poverty of the lack of culture, because I don't think it's appropriate that youth have to craft their own sense of purpose and meaning, right? That's actually an anomaly. That when you're embedded in a meaningful community, or i.e. village, it's the mentors, it's the elders, it's the uncles, it's the aunties, it's everybody that's affirming to you, right? Who you are, what your medicine is, how to participate meaningfully. So it's not up to you as an individual. And I think, again, a lot of the self-mastery that we experience now, like a lot of people have this sense of, you have to master yourself fully and craft your own meaning and all this stuff too, is also, it's in the wake of something that's already happened, which is the loss of a cultural tapestry, which would have made it clear to you without needing to come up with yourself. So it's important, I think, with all these conversations as well, that's the sort of, my teacher, Stephen Jenkinson, would say, that's the crater that we're already in, right? You can almost call it the consequence of colonization already happened. And this is what we think has always been true, not realizing, right, what is rightfully not here, which should be. And again, last thing I'll say about this is why it was so impactful for me to go to a place like Tamera, the community in Portugal that I ended up spending 10 years making a documentary about, 4 visits over 5 years. And what was meaningfully experienced and kindled in me was what it actually may feel like to be embedded once again meaningfully with other people. And it affected me so deeply that I haven't stopped, being lit up and being of service to that ever since.
Thank you, Ian. That's deeply insightful. And I think the crater, one of the consequences or the consequent attempts to claw our way out of that crater is the the postmodern thought movement, right? The basis that we, in fact, ought to generate our own meaning. And the sense that you said that it's unfair for young men, or I might extend that to say anyone, to be tasked with generating enough meaning to fill the void of not being invited into a meaningful cosmology is certain to generate existential dread and a lot of mental health crises, just relationship crises, social crises. There's no way that we can do that because it's not ours to do. And this idea of tapestry is deeply beautiful. And I think that it also harkens back to a point that we spoke about a little earlier about why this era of traditional American masculinity is attractive, because it offers a place. We might note that that tapestry is influenced by imperial thought, by a demythologized thought, by a desacralized mind, and a colonized mind in some sense. And yet the expectancy, the desire, the need to be placed somewhere in this larger tapestry of humanity, of nature, of life is so strong that we can look back to a time and say, yeah, well, we were all smoking cigarettes, getting drunk, and beating our wives, but it was probably better than now. It's like, wow, nope. But the need is still there. And that's quite potent. So I think there's a lot of threads we could pick up on. But before we do, let's take a short break and come back with the second half of the show. I hope you're enjoying the show so far. I wanted to take a brief moment to talk about just how you can help this show grow into the future. Did you know that we have an Instagram, a YouTube, and a Patreon? Probably. But if you're listening on YouTube, like many of you are, I would invite you to subscribe, to like this video if you've enjoyed it, and to leave a comment. Let me know what you thought. Let me know if you have any questions or maybe guests that you want me to interview. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple Music or any other podcast platform, then please take this moment to rate the show. All of these actions go a long way to helping the Smiling Human podcast reach more people and grow into the future. Thank you so much. Excellent. Well, we are now back with our second half, which means we are moving into the section called the Question of the Week. This is where I invite our guests to bring forward an inquiry, something that is important to them, meaningful, or a general curiosity that they want to share with the audience. So, Ian, what have you got for us this week?
Well, I had a wondering that the story of Iron John is seen, or at least Bly's version of it, is seen as an initiatory pathway for men to go from adolescent into adulthood. And I wonder for you, I mean, on the one hand, this story, right, has been around, I mean, maybe not a long time really in terms of, the wider mythic time, let's say 30 years or so, as it was revivified by Bly. But do you feel that there's perhaps another myth or themes that would speak to the passage that men are being called into now, or perhaps, once they've done this first one, what lies on the other side of that is relevant and contextual to these times?
It's an interesting one. There is an eternal element to this hero's journey, to the movement of boy to manhood. And I think at all times that is relevant. However, because of all the elements that we've spoken to that are informing the masculine mind within culture across all different dispositions, there is no one myth that stands out in my mind that would capture what it is that we're going through right now. Themes, though, yes. One of the themes is remembering. I would say the theme of remembering after delusion or after being asleep. And I know it's not a male myth, but almost like Snow White, like a deep, deep slumber, waking up into a world of truth, a world of life. It seems to me that this deep and natural yearning that is coming forward within the masculine sphere to have a place, to have a purpose, to be pursuing something meaningful is so strong that it's able to, no matter what degree of illusion or disparate habituated nonsense that we might be perpetuating in our lives, it still pierces through. We have this deep impulse towards it. And so this idea of illusion, I don't have a place, there's no potency in masculinity, men aren't needed. This is some part of some cultural narratives that men have digested, versus it ought to be something different, right? There's illusion on both fronts. But breaking out of that and coming to the realization that there is a place for us, for you specifically, listener, like you, one of one, unique as you are, that theme of remembering, I think, is absolutely central. I think as well, I wanted to note that this hero's journey is the journey of the boy. And this is one of the pieces that I've been sort of grappling with in my study of symbol, my study of myth. I've been going through Mircea Eliade, I've been going through Jung, I've been going through, about to get into Edward Edinger as well, and just really digging my teeth into it and recognizing that so much of the talk or the podcasts or the work that I have witnessed and been a part of has been this support from boyhood to manhood, that journey. But what do we do when we're there? What do we do when the son has come home as a man? What do we do when the prince, so to say, has claimed his throne? What are the myths that inform how a man lives in his kingdom? And this is something that I see in part, say, we talked about J.R.R. Tolkien before in Lord of the Rings. There's some excellent expression of kingliness in those books and in those movies as well. But overall, I think there's an absence of those kind of myths that we could be wanting, are wanting, and would be deeply informative for us. But I'd be curious to hear what you have to say. Is there a myth that sort of encapsulates or speaks to this time in your mind?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting because, again, if we come to an understanding of where do myths come from, right? And one understanding is that myths come from the land, right? It's the land dreaming, and those are picked up by the humans who belong to that place and are able to bring expression to that and live it out, right? And this is the big shift too when you understand that in mythically alive cultures, it's not so much about, it's not like a myth is sort of dead on the page, right? That it's actually something that is enacted over and over again. And there's different ways of enacting, right, particular scenes of a myth, or how a boy, or how they correspond to specific places even, right? Like there's myths around this particular area in the Cowichan territory where it speaks about, right, different, like a mountain, right, and how that mountain came to be, or what the chief was who and what he did there. And so it's they're both a geographic map as well as mythic, and they encode a certain sense of how to be somewhere, right? How to be in reciprocity. So from that understanding of myth and that they come from the land, that makes sense, certainly. And at the same time, I do think that there's a source of myth that comes through and is expressed through media, right? In different ways, like film, books, and that they're in some sense more contemporary, or at least the expressions are more contemporary, right? And I mean, Avatar is a very interesting example of that, right? If you kind of release it from, a Hollywood film, that you see like a very archetypal battle happening, right? And you can say, well, James Cameron came up with this, but I saw some chart, it was, I think, when Avatar 1 came out, and it was like showing the different story points of a certain reoccurring motif, right? Of the white savior. Well, I mean, it was one criticism, of course. In this case, he sort of paired it with like Last of the Mohicans or Pocahontas or whatever. Like there was just saying, oh, this is an interesting reoccurring motif, right? It's the white savior myth. So that's one example of looking at that film artifact in a way. It's just that reiterating again. And you could also see that there is this depiction of this archetypal battle between, you could say, indigeneity and the technium, maybe one way of saying it, right? Like the colonizing force, the force that wants to go into a place, extract what it believes is valuable for its own empire at the expense of the people in the place, which is, again, I mean, it's something that's happened and is continuing to happen all around the world. So it's just reflecting this archetypal battle at play. And it's interesting because if you see it as well as a myth that invites in a colonized consciousness to reawaken to relationship, and also what it might even feel like to be in relationship to place and people in a meaningful way, right? And it's fascinating too. Avatar, again, was very immersive, right? It was sort of the most immersive film that's come out, filmed in hyper 3D and, all this kind of stuff. And they even say that people walked out of that theater, at least the first time, in, like a parking lot in Wisconsin or wherever, right? Coming out of Pandora, which is this epic jungle, rich, diverse ecosystem, again, all generated with computer graphics, but still a feeling of like the wonder. And then coming out into a parking lot, right? And looking around at the strip mall and being like, oh my God, what have we done? Like, this was Pandora. Earth was and still is Pandora. So it's awakening again the grief, right? Of, wait a second. So it's like the colonized are somewhat waking up to like, wait, what have we done? Because it's so easy to forget, right? This original understanding. And I think men as you could say not necessarily the originators of empire. This is interesting to even consider this, right? Because oftentimes when we hear things like patriarchy is the problem, it can reinforce this idea that it's somehow a flaw with men, right? Like, oh, men did this, men are terrible, men need to get better, they need to correct the defect or at least get out of the way so women can be in charge. But there's something else I think that unlocks when you could imagine that empire itself is a kind of force. It's a kind of deity, right? Or it's a kind of forgetting. And this is also where, for example, another powerful myth that came out, based on a book, which I'm sure you've seen, The Never-Ending Story, right? Which is, I saw that when I was a kid and it's affected me deeply, right? And, not to give away too many spoilers, but that story, The Never-Ending Story, which again is such a beautiful articulation of life, like the infinite game of life, right? The never-ending story, is at deep peril by this something that emerges called the nothing, right? That wants to eat and take away and starts destroying the alternate fantasy reality, at least that is in the story. But the nothing isn't so much a thing unto itself. It's actually humans forgetting to tell the story is what conjures the nothing. Or, said differently, you could say humans not holding up their end of the, if we're talking about that's the other world and this is this world, humans aren't holding up their end, so the other world suffers. And so to me, that also provides a very contemporary mythic understanding of what's at stake right now, right? Is in the great forgetting of our necessary reciprocal tether and relationship to life itself, right? And if we talk about masculinity again, masculinity being pressed in service, unconscious service to empire, right? And then we see, oh, this is what masculinity is. It's always going to go this way. But maybe I'll end with this to say I've been blessed with my, she's a friend and a mentor, Indigenous grandmother, Pat McCabe, who in my interview I did with her a number of years ago, it's called a Thriving Life and a Prayer for All Men. And she offers a beautiful blessing for men, basically inviting them into what she calls the paradigm of thriving life, which is that you do have a necessary place to play. And I know you've been sort of pressed into service, coerced, right, into be tools of empire, when actually, you don't really want that. Your heart doesn't really want that. You want to feel like you matter, of course, but that you're also connected to a much vaster, beautiful story of which you are not the center of the story, right? That's the ego thinks it's the center of the story. But you're not the center, but you are part of that story. And in fact, that's where we can drive our deepest sense of meaning, to be in service to that the story continues.
The words right relationship come to mind. And when you're speaking about men having a place, and we talked about this in the first half as well, this desire to be oriented. And it's interesting when we speak about empire, because empire does tie, obviously, deeply into this idea of a dominance hierarchy. And it's almost as though empire is the idol. Like I wrote empire as idolatry as I was listening to you, in the sense that it occupies, or whatever is quintessential to the empirical, if that's even the right word for it, the empire-like drive and essence, that occupies the highest place in the value hierarchy. And as such, all other roles, systems, people, structures are then feeding into this distorted idol. It's not actually worthy. I call it an idol because it's not worthy of occupying the highest peak of this value hierarchy. And for those listeners who it may not be clear for, there is a meaningful distinction between a dominance hierarchy and a value hierarchy. And not all hierarchies are dominance based either. There's many different other kinds. And this beautiful piece that you offered when you were speaking about Avatar got me thinking, in a sense, as it relates to forgetting. You talked about seeing this archetypal battle as between indigeneity and the technium, or the colonizer, or this empire that is almost parasitically infected with this forgetting. And one of the pieces that came up recently while I was speaking at an online convergence called The Roots of Resilience, hosted by Tay Tayari. He hosts the Wild Heart Revival podcast. If you haven't listened to it, it's definitely worth a listen. At the end, he and I were having a conversation about indigeneity, and I wonder what you think about this. This takes us a little bit away, but I do genuinely value your insight here, and it might be an interesting note to close on here. My disposition is such that if we are earthborn, then we are indigenous to Earth, and that there are primary peoples, custodians of land, of islands, of spaces, of living earthen architecture. There are people who are secondary people who show up later. There's the colonizer who comes to take, right? There's all of these different things. But indigeneity seems to be on a spectrum, in a sense, insofar as all of us are earthborn, indigenous in this sense, and that we have a place on Earth, and we have to remember that we have a place on Earth, and that that's a part of the forgetting, is that when we forget that we actually belong to the Earth, then we forget the responsibility we have to the Earth, to all of our more than human kin, to all of our kin in different nations on different lands, and these types of things. But the archetypal battle, the idea that indigeneity is on one side and the colonizer is on the other, it almost might be recapitulated to say that the battle is between those who live in the knowing of their place in unity, active and embodied in their responsibility, in their heart, in their wholeness, and those who have forgotten and are chasing a false idol. How does that land?
Yeah. I mean, this is, I think, also helpful to employ the work of James P. Carse. He wrote the book Finite and Infinite Games. Not sure if you've read it or touched on it here. Yeah, it's a really, really powerful look at this understanding through this lens, which he basically breaks down this idea between, again, finite games and infinite games. And he has, there's rules that govern a finite game and rules that govern an infinite game. And he says, in a finite game, you play to win. And we could be talking about a soccer match. It's like, in a finite game, you play to win. And it's important to know who the winner is in a finite game, right? Because imagine you played a game and nobody played by the rules and nobody kept score, and I mean, that you could call that pickup, and it's just having fun with your buddies or something, sure. But in terms of an actual structured finite game, it's like, yeah, you want to know who the winner is. On the contrast, infinite game is you play to keep playing, right? The point of the game is to perpetuate the game itself. And there's something around this idea that the colonization or empire itself, right, more broadly, and by empire meaning, the willingness to essentially supersede your own or the boundaries of place and begin to take, right, and usurp and encroach and swallow up other people, places, cultures because of this insatiable desire for more, right? It's never enough. It's more, more, more. That is a finite game, right? Because the final outcome of that is a dead planet, right? And you could say the economic system as it's structured now, hyper-masculine, sort of abstract fantasy, right, on top of actually the, quote, real, as in the natural, touchable landscape of things, right? Now we have even crypto stuff, which, again, it's mixed about whether or not that's a good thing. A lot of people who are fanatics about it say this is the revolution, this is going to change everything. So far, I don't know. I see a lot of people getting sucked up into numbers and tickers on screens and lost in this like slot machine, right? Which is also a dangerous thing, I think. But there's the current economic system itself, which again perpetuates a system that is always insatiably seeking more, is a finite game. Now, you could even say the life prolonging technologies and the people, right, that want to persist forever, of which I'm sure there's a bunch of them now. The folks who, one percenters and have a bunch of money, right? They're now really trying to figure out, how can I live forever, right? Because I don't want to die. I want to persist. Now, the challenge with that, of course, is that a system that never willing to die means that it will just consume everything else to support your own perpetuation or its own perpetuation, right, at the expense of everything else, and call that worth it. And so there's also a mythic understanding from, I think, older goddess worshiping cultures, that they had this recognition that they call it the law of infinite return, right? Which is that, when it's your turn to die, that you are being gathered up into the great cosmic unfolding of life, and that you will return. And I mean, I don't know if that's specifically reincarnation or, Buddhist or Hindu mythologies. I'm not really touching on that, but like a sense that you never exit, you don't go to nothing, right? Because the great fear that lies at the heart of empire is nothingness, right? This is the great fear of death as well that's plagues so many when they get to that threshold. And my teacher, Stephen Jenkinson, worked in hospice care for many years. He spoke about this at length, right? That folks would get to that threshold and then like this complete terror would overtake them. More often than not, even the ones that had some religious, sense of, or even Buddhist, it doesn't matter. It's all Maya, but they'd get there and be like, holy shit, this is a huge threshold. Because there's this fear of that after this, there's nothing, right? To be or not to be. And so I believe that's what perpetuates empire as well. The impulsive empire. It doesn't want to not exist, right? It presses everything to its service. Now, from a deeper understanding of being invited into a meaningful cosmology, where, for example, you become an ancestor, right? Until you cycle back again, as a lot of indigenous understandings seem to be, that it's not so. I'm sure there's fear and there's pain and there's grief, obviously, but it doesn't mean it's existential nothingness that awaits you, and that matters actually to how you're willing to live life and what your responsibility is to your land, the land that you're on, and people that were there before you and the people that come again. So that is the willingness to participate in the infinite game. And so this is what I'm sort of understanding to be that awakening, essentially, right? The awakening from realizing that the current trajectory we're on is a finite game, which is, the outcome is very clear. Like, it's not hard to see. And the climate change consequences and societal breakdown and the shift towards fascism, all of these are part of the symptoms. right, of the more uncertainty that has been unleashed by the impact of empire. And the invitation, again and again and again, maybe this, I'm hearing Mary Oliver now, the wild geese, just the invitation is that life is constantly beckoning us back and saying, hey, come, you're still part of the story if you're willing, come home again.
Mm-hmm. Beautifully put, brother. The dance between the finite and the infinite game speaks a lot to the research of Dr. Piaget and the developmental psychology of play that he worked on. And when we distill that, the essence of his work out could be, at least on one axis, be distilled as the best way to play is not to win, but it's to ensure that you can continue playing for as long as possible. It's iterative, right? Mm-hmm. And what's interesting is that when we look at that research, and this will be, I suppose, the closing point here, that the aspect that informs the individual in a way that allows them to play the infinite game, at least insofar as we're talking about social development, is this sociability. It is rooted in empathy. It's rooted in this reciprocal exchange and being able to, as an innate capacity, put ourselves in somebody else's shoes. And what's interesting is that you spoke earlier about the Wolf on Wall Street and noting that DiCaprio's character was likely a sociopath. Well, sociopathy and psychopathy and borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, these are all antisocial personality disorders. And what they do when they are activated is that they will sacrifice relationship for short-term gain. That the sociopath or the psychopath will sacrifice relationship for short-term gain. And this is that emptiness, right? It is really this false idol of empire, the false idol of the ego self, the false idol of the one who is in charge of making all of the meaning, the ultimate meaning maker, the ultimate myth maker. There's a lot of different pieces in here. So I think that's a really beautiful way to wrap this up. Ian, thank you so much. I'd love to offer you the opportunity to let the people know who are listening, if they're curious about maybe some of the documentaries you've made, the work that you're offering out of Vancouver Island, or anything else that you've got going on. What's alive for you and where can they find you?
Yeah, thanks, Oak. So if men want to connect, well, men and women actually, because there's some offerings for women as well, but if they want to connect with the Mythic Masculine, you head to themythicmasculine.com, as well as the film that was named about the community of Tamera in Portugal. That film is called The Village of Lovers, which we have our global release. I'm not sure when this will be published, but in late January, we'll have our final global release of that film. You can check it out, thevillageoflovers.com. And as far as in-person offerings as well for men, we particularly focus on creating ritual spaces for kind of like a repatterning and reclamation of eros, of life energy, that primal intelligence of life, and healing shame around sexuality. And again, coming back into right relationship with this energy and putting it in service to life. So much of the themes that we touched on here have certainly been what has emerged for myself and my collaborator, Deus Forte, who I understand also has been on the show. That this is where we're most jazzed about, is creating these kinds of spaces for men. So again, they can reawaken, repattern, and then repurpose that potent life force towards being in service.
Beautiful. And as always, all of that information will be down in the show notes and the link description. Ian, thank you so much for your time, your contribution, and your wisdom. It's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you today.
Thanks, Oak. Thanks for having me.
And that concludes this episode of the Smiling Human podcast. Thank you so much for listening. But before you go, I have 2 invitations for you. The first invitation is to receive a free gift. I've created a free insight journal. This is a 30-day self-reflection and introspection journal that you can download at no cost in the description below. Go have a look and join the journey. The second invitation I have for you is, if it feels within your means and possible for you, then please head over to patreon.com/thesmilinghuman. Becoming a patron will give you access to perks like behind-the-scenes footage and access to live Q&As with me monthly. You also get voting privileges to help pick new guests or to help guide other episode content. Truly, the support of listeners like you, paid or unpaid, goes a long way. So if you could like, share, subscribe, and give a rating on the podcast app, all of that goes a long way. Thank you to each and every one of you who's been on this journey with me. See you again soon.